You open the fridge door and cold air hits your face. Inside, there's a carton of milk with a date stamped on the side, a bag of spinach with a barcode, a jar of peanut butter with a label listing every single ingredient down to the milligram. You don't think twice about any of it. You grab the milk, checks the date out of habit more than fear, and pour it into your coffee without a single thought about whether it might kill you. That confidence, that total absence of dread, is one of the strangest luxuries a human being has ever had. For nearly all of human history, every single bite of food was a gamble with your life, and there was no label, no expiration date, no government agency standing between you and a slow, agonizing death by poisoning. So the question is simple. For hundreds of thousands of years, with no science, no labs, and no way to test what a plant or mushroom or berry might do to your body, how did early humans figure out what was safe to eat without wiping themselves out in the process? The first answer starts inside your own mouth, and it's older than humanity itself. Your tongue is covered in taste receptors, and one specific type is doing something far more dramatic than helping you enjoy dessert. Bitterness in the natural world is chemistry's version of a warning label. Many toxic compounds in plants, alkaloid and cyanogenic glycosides, the nasty stuff evolution designed to stop animals from eating them, happen to taste intensely bitter to the human tongue. Geneticists have identified a gene called TAS2R38 that controls how strongly a person perceives bitterness. And it turns out humans carry an unusually large family of bitter taste receptor genes compared to many other mammals. Around 25 of them, each tuned to detect a slightly different toxic compound. That's not an accident. That's millions of years of natural selection building a chemical alarm system directly into your face. Here's what doesn't make sense until you think about it. You were never taught to hate bitter flavors. Watch any toddler bite into a raw dandelion leaf or an unripe persimmon and see the instant grimace, the tongue thrust forward, the immediate spit. That reaction isn't learned. It's ancient software running exactly as designed, installed long before your ancestors ever stood upright. Bitterness was the first line of defense, and it saved lives before language even existed to warn anyone about anything. But taste alone couldn't catch everything. Some of the deadliest plants and fungi on Earth taste completely unremarkable, sometimes even pleasant, until the poison is already working its way through the bloodstream. So the body needed a second system, one that worked after the fact instead of before it. In the 1950s and 60s, a psychologist named John Garcia ran a series of experiments that would eventually be nicknamed the Garcia effect, and it explained something that farmers and hunters had noticed for centuries without understanding why. If an animal eats something and later becomes violently ill, it will develop an intense, sometimes permanent aversion to that specific food, even if the illness happened hours later and had nothing directly connected to it in the moment. This is why rats develop what researchers call bait shyness, refusing poison food after a single sickening exposure, even when hunger should push them to eat almost anything. Early humans had this exact same wiring. One bad mushroom, one round of violent vomiting after eating a certain red berry, and that plant became marked in the brain forever. No biology degree required. Think about that for a second. Your body was capable of writing its own poison database, using nothing but nausea as the pen. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't painless.
But it worked. And it worked well enough to keep entire family groups alive generation after generation. Here's the part nobody talks about, though. Individual trial and error alone would have killed far too many people to sustain a species. A single person learning through personal illness is useful, but slow and dangerous. And some lessons only need to be taught once because the person who learned them didn't survive to pass anything on. This is where the real secret weapon comes in, and it isn't biology at all. It's memory, spoken aloud, generation after generation. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer societies that survived into the modern era, like the Hadza of Tanzania or the San peoples of the Kalahari, have documented something remarkable: encyclopedic, highly specific plant knowledge passed almost entirely through oral tradition, often carried disproportionately by older women in the group. Grandmothers, quite literally, functioned as the walking, talking safety manuals of prehistoric life. Researchers analyzing ancient human coprolites, essentially fossilized feces, from a site called Hines Cave in Texas, found evidence of an astonishingly diverse plant diet stretching back thousands of years, including species that require very specific preparation to be edible at all. That kind of knowledge doesn't appear from nowhere. It survives because someone deliberately taught it to someone else, who taught it to someone else across dozens or hundreds of generations. An unbroken chain of, don't eat that, but this, prepared this way, will keep you alive. Somewhere in that chain, real people died learning lessons the rest of the tribe never had to learn again. And some of the most dangerous foods on Earth weren't avoided at all. They were conquered, through a process so clever it's almost unsettling that our ancestors figured it out with no chemistry whatsoever. Take cassava, also called manioc, a starchy root that has fed millions of people across South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia for thousands of years. Raw. Bitter cassava contains cyanogenic glycosides, compounds that release actual cyanide when broken down in the body, akakit. Eaten carelessly, it can kill a person within hours. And yet, indigenous communities in the Amazon developed an elaborate multi-step detoxification process, grating the root, soaking it in water for days, pressing out the toxic liquid, and then fermenting or cooking what remained, transforming a poison into a dietary staple that entire civilizations built themselves around. Acorns tell a similar story. Oak trees produce nuts loaded with bitter tannins, compounds that in high concentration cause serious digestive damage, yet indigenous Californian communities developed leaching techniques, grinding the acorns into meal and running water through them repeatedly, sometimes using specially built stone basins to pull the tannins out entirely. This wasn't guesswork stumbled upon in an afternoon. This was generational engineering, refined over centuries, applied to a plant that would otherwise sit there uneaten and quietly toxic. Fire itself may be the single greatest detoxification tool your ancestors ever discovered, since heat breaks down many plant toxins and destroys dangerous bacteria and parasites that raw food carries. Anthropologist Richard Wrangham has argued that the control of fire, sometime around 1.8 million years ago according to some estimates, didn't just make food taste better or easier to chew. It fundamentally expanded the entire menu of what a human being could safely survive on. Even your ancestors' closest relatives were running their own version of this same experiment, and watching them may have taught early humans more than we usually give credit for. Primatologist Michael Huffman spent decades observing wild chimpanzees in Tanzania's Mahala Mountains and documented something researchers now call zoopharmacognosy, essentially animals self-medicating with plants. Sick chimpanzees were repeatedly observed seeking out and chewing the pith of a plant called Vernonia amygdalina, intensely bitter and normally avoided, but loaded with compounds that appear to fight intestinal parasites. Healthy chimps ignored it almost entirely. Something in the animal's own biology, some internal signal of illness, was directing it toward a specific bitter medicine at exactly the moment it needed it. Parrots in Peru's Manu National Park gather by the hundreds at exposed clay riverbanks, eating the mineral-rich soil in a behavior scientists believe helps neutralize toxic compounds from the unripe fruit and seeds. that make up much of their diet. Pregnant women, in cultures across the world, from parts of Africa to the American South, have historically shown cravings for clay, a behavior called geophagy, which some researchers believe may serve a similar toxin-binding, mineral-supplying purpose during a biologically vulnerable time. Early humans almost certainly watched this exact kind of behavior in the animals around them, noticed which plants sick creatures sought out, and folded that observation into their own survival knowledge. Nature had already been running the experiment. Humans just had to be paying attention. The deepest evidence of just how far this knowledge went comes from a place that shouldn't exist, at least not according to how Neanderthals were once portrayed. At a site called Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq, archaeologist Ralph Selecki excavated Neanderthal remains in the 1950s and 60s, buried alongside heavy concentrations of pollen from plants including yarrow and cornflower, species with known medicinal properties, still used in some traditional remedies today. The interpretation has been debated for decades, and some researchers argue burrowing rodents may have carried some of that pollen in afterward. But more recent dental plaque analysis on other Neanderthal remains has independently found chemical traces consistent with medicinal plant consumption, including compounds from poplar bark, a natural source of a chemical closely related to aspirin. And Neanderthals weren't the only ones. When hikers discovered the naturally mummified body of a man now called Ötzi, frozen in the Ötztal Alps, and dated to roughly 3,300 BCE, researchers found him carrying 2 pieces of birch polypore fungus, a species known to contain compounds toxic to intestinal parasites, threaded onto a leather cord as though it were carried deliberately as medicine. This wasn't blind luck repeated by accident. This was applied, tested, transmitted knowledge, refined over unimaginable spans of time, carried in pouches and pockets by people who understood something about the natural world that most of us have never had to learn. Step back far enough, and what you're really looking at isn't a story about berries and bitter leaves at all. It's a story about the sheer, staggering cost of the safety you take completely for granted. Every single plant you can eat without fear. Every root vegetable, every leafy green, every grain in a loaf of bread was tested by someone, somewhere, at some point in deep human history, often at the cost of real suffering and sometimes real death. Nobody wrote it down in a database. There was no International Food Safety Organization cataloging results. There was only memory, bitter tongues, violent nausea, careful grandmothers, and an unbroken chain of trust running from one generation directly into the next. Here's what doesn't make sense until you sit with it for a moment. Modern science has now confirmed, compound by compound, gene by gene, mechanism by mechanism, things that human beings figured out through nothing but observation and grief, tens of thousands of years before anyone understood what a molecule even. So let's count what your ancestors were actually up against, because laid out all at once, it's almost hard to believe anyone survived it at all. Bitter, invisible poisons hiding in plain sight inside ordinary-looking plants, a body that could only learn some lessons the hard way, through sickness that came hours after the mistake was already made, deadly staple foods, like cassava and acorns that had to be painstakingly re-engineered over generations, from poison into nourishment. And a knowledge base so vast and so specific that it could never live in one person's head alone, but had to be spoken, taught, and carried forward by grandmothers, elders, and careful observation of the animals living alongside them. 4 enormous problems. And somehow, patiently, brutally, dadiod, across hundreds of thousands of years, your ancestors answered every single one. Yay, shade, zoom out. Even further, and something almost uncomfortable becomes clear. That casual trust you feel every time you walk down a grocery aisle, that total absence of fear when you bite into an apple or add spinach to a salad isn't natural. It isn't something built into the modern world by accident. It's inherited. It's the end result of an almost unthinkable number of small, painful, sometimes fatal experiments run by people whose names were never recorded, whose only legacy was the plain fact that you don't have to be afraid of your own dinner. You didn't earn that safety. You were simply born into the very end of an extraordinarily long, extraordinarily costly chain of people who were. So go back to that fridge. Look at the milk carton with its printed date, the spinach in its plastic bag, the peanut butter with its long list of safe, familiar ingredients. None of that convenience appeared out of nowhere. It's standing on top of a mountain of bitter mouthfuls, sick stomachs, careful grandmothers, and a few unlucky people, thousands of generations ago, who ate the wrong thing so that you, one day, far in the future, would never have to wonder if your next bite might be your last.